everybody see me and hear me? All right, I didn't wear my heels. It's too painful. So like Sean said, this is my topic for today. But before I talk about this specifically, I want to draw the bigger picture, also talk about the monitoring program that we've established at Corkscrew and how this really all fits in, because it's a really small piece of the bigger puzzle. The monitoring program here at Corkscrew was established in 2013. It's a long-term project, and we're looking at the effects of restoration. So keep in mind when I talk, this is really only like preliminary data, kind of a snippet of what we really intend to do with this project. So if the data or something seems not as clean as I would like, I apologize, but that's just to put it in some context. The reason we're doing this monitoring is to put science behind restoration work. Lots of restoration work has been done, but we're not quite sure what the real effects or changes are. And in particular with this area, we're talking about short hydro-period wetlands. Jason didn't pull this map up this morning, which is kind of disappointing because he's always loves his maps, but it's kind of famous here at Corkscrew. What you see here is on the left you have pre-development, and on the right you have post-development, and the pink color represents the short hydro-period wetlands. And you can see, comparing the two, there has been a significant loss in the area. And of course, I can't talk about this without mentioning the wood storks, which are federally threatened species. We know that they rely on wetlands for foraging, and it's so important for them when they're rearing their young. And we also know that they're an umbrella species. So for meeting the needs of the wood storks in the area, we're going to be meeting the needs of many other species and improving the area. So the monitoring program, we have a couple different branches or components, 7 in total at the moment. The first is aquatic fauna. We then have birds, which is what I'll be touching on today. Hydrology, mammal monitoring, vegetation, wading birds, and then I don't have a picture for herpetology because we're actually in the process of establishing a herp monitoring program here. It's not actually on the ground yet, but we're really excited about what that can mean for us. So the data I'm talking about today is actually from before 2013, from when the monitoring program started. It actually kind of all culminated from an intern project. A past intern named Kate Halstead in 2009 is really passionate about birds and wanted her intern project to be about point counts. During her time here, she was actually able to accomplish quite a lot. She established protocols, she established routes, and was able to begin surveying, and we've been kind of keeping it up ever since. All of her work focused on Panther Island Mitigation Bank along with the expansion site. Her routes covered 4 phases of Panther Island, totaling to 42 points. The points were selected using a 200-meter grid system, and they were conducted quarterly. So to give you a visual, these are the 4 phases that were surveyed. Corkscrew Road is kind of probably up the ceiling right way up here, and this is the northern edge of the sanctuary property. And here's the same image, but I went ahead and put all 42 points on the map, and I've also color-coded them so you can see where the routes lie. So, here's one route here, the yellow route, the white or gray route there. So our surveys were a 1 surveyor or 1 observer method. We could only do, one surveyor can only do 1 route per day due to time restrictions. They are all variable radius counts with a maximum of 200-meter radius and a viewing range of 360 degrees. Each route consisted of 6 points, and we limited travel time between each points to 15 minutes. The time restrictions I talked about, we had to begin the surveys within 30 minutes of sunrise, and they couldn't last longer than 3 hours after sunrise. When the surveyor first arrives at each point, we had a 3-minute waiting period. And during that time, details like weather and background noise were recorded. So once the waiting period was over, the counts were 5 minutes long, and all birds that were visually or audibly detected were reported. And along with that, the surveyor would note how far away they are in meters and how many there were. So for the analysis part, I guess the meat of my talk here, we did 2 different kinds of analyses. We did a multivariate analysis, looking at the differences in community structure, and we we looked at habitat and season. And with the univariate analysis, we looked at the differences in specific species, also with habitat and season. When I say habitat and season, so seasons, the typical what you would think of, summer, fall, winter, and spring. And then with habitat, we had to look at each point and categorize habitats that way. I ended up with 4 habitat types. The first was ag or disturbed, which consisted of 13 of the total 42 points. And disturbed is probably the most common habitat type that you'd see at our restoration sites. It's pre-restoration. Some sites were in the middle doing some construction, but right now this is typically what we see. The second habitat category is forested, and that was 5 out of the 42 points. The third category was transition habitats, which is 9 out of the 42 points. And the way we determined transition is I looked at a point, and if there were multiple habitat types within 50 meters of a point, so like some of them, it would be in the marsh habitat, but literally like 5 feet behind you, you'd have the forested area, you'd have a marsh area, or I'm sorry, the transit ag area. I'm gonna, tongue getting all twisted. So yeah, 50 meters, it was considered a transition. And then the fourth habitat type was marsh, which was 15 out of the 42 points. So for the multivariate analysis, I created an MDS graph. I know some people are familiar, but if you're not, it just looks like a jumble of points. But essentially what it is one point here represents the community structure at one survey point during one season. And the distance between the 2 points tells you how similar or dissimilar they are. So if the points are closer to each other, they're more similar, and the farther apart they are, the less similar they are. So like I said, I mean, if I asked you guys to tell me what you saw here, I mean, what are you going to say? It's just a bunch of points. So I went ahead and color-coded them by habitat, and now we can start to see what kind of trends will show up with the data we have. Before I get into that, we also ran an analysis of similarity, and what we saw here is that communities did vary by habitat, but the community structure did not vary by season. So if you go back to the graph, the first thing you see is, I drew fancy circles everywhere, the forested and the, oh, wow, this button went really fast. Forested and the disturbed habitats were really similar, and in fact they actually overlapped each other. The marsh habitat was not very similar, and the overlap is, I don't know if you can see it in the back, it's maybe right here. So very little overlap there. And the fourth habitat, transition, overlapped all other habitats, which is to be expected. What you already saw here, the univariate analysis, we did see trends when we looked both at season and habitat, which was a little different than the multivariate. Here I have the words common species. We only looked at species in the univariate analysis that had an incidence of 5% or higher. Everything else we categorized as rare species. So of 12 common species we looked at, 11 of them had habitat variation. And we were able to see a couple trends. The first were species that were more commonly seen in the marsh. The example here I have is the common Gallium, which was more commonly seen in the marsh than any of the other habitat types, and that was the same for the sandhill crane. 4 other species were also more commonly seen in the marsh: the boat-tailed grackle, common yellow throat, red-shouldered hawk, and red-winged blackbird, but they were only more commonly seen in the marsh when compared to the disturbed habitat. The second trend were species more commonly seen in the disturbed habitat. Example I have here is the eastern meadowlark, which is more commonly seen in the ag than the marsh and transition habitats. The gray catbird was more commonly seen in disturbed when only compared to the marsh. The third trend were species more commonly seen in the forest. The example here is the red-bellied woodpecker. It was more commonly seen in the forested than any of the other 3 habitats. And the mourning dove was more commonly seen in the forest than the marsh. I do realize that there is a lot of variation in this forested point right here, but it was still significant in the analysis. And like I said in the beginning, it is important to keep in mind it's kind of our preliminary data. There were only 42 points, but I didn't want you to think that I didn't realize that. For the seasonal variation, 5 out of the 12 common species saw variation. We had 2 trends. The first were species that were more commonly seen in the spring and summer than fall and winter. I could have said dry season and wet season, but all of the species that I'll talk about aren't really reliant on the water levels. So I'm going to just have the mouthful of spring, summer, fall, and winter. Northern cardinal here was more commonly seen in the spring and summer than the fall and winter. Mourning dove was more commonly seen in the spring and summer than just the fall. The other trend was the exact opposite, of species more commonly seen in the fall and winter than spring and summer. The example here, great catbird, was more commonly seen in the fall and winter than spring and summer, whereas the common yellow throat was only more commonly seen in the fall than compared to the spring and summer. Another thing I wanted to point out was something Sally mentioned before, was the report that National Audubon Society put out about the climate change and how birds would be reacting to it. And of the total 88 species we detected, 29 would be considered either climate endangered or climate threatened, which is about a third of our species we detected here. Some of them, just to name a few, were the American bittern, the aninga, black-throated blue warbler, greater yellowlegs, king rail, pine warbler, roseate spoonbill, sandhill crane, and tricolored heron. And I just wanted to make this note because even though they weren't considered common species now, I think it's a really important part of the work we're doing, especially as a long-term project, being able to monitor these species. So to conclude everything, I think what's really significant is our ability to actually detect these trends, both temporally and spatially. It's really encouraging for, as a long-term project, that in the short time period and the sample size that we had, that we were actually able to detect these trends. The multivariate analysis showed us that the communities varied by habitat. The univariate analysis showed that almost all except one species varied by habitat, and only some species did vary by season. And like I just mentioned, detecting those climate endangered and climate threatened species. For the future of monitoring, at the moment we are maintaining the current frequency of our counts. We're in the process of recruiting and training volunteers to help us conduct these point counts, which would allow us to establish new routes, which would also expand our sampling area. And we're also potentially hoping to incorporate our protocol into the monthly bird surveys that Sally had mentioned earlier. Acknowledgements, because we do have lots of people who have helped us out. Allison Webb hiding in the corner. She does a lot of our surveys in the last couple of years, and she's been a great asset and has worked really hard, and we really appreciate all the work she does. Some past interns, like I mentioned, Kate Halstead, who basically started the whole project or was the inspiration. Kyle Pritchard, Hannah Nardi, and Greg Kosick were also past interns that helped with the surveys. And our director, Jason Larson, who's always, his continued support of the program has always been appreciated. Thanks.
Great. Again, we're running short on time. We could probably take one question, sneak it in, and we'll hold the rest for the break report. All right, everybody's ready to move on to lunch.